Hi, welcome. Whenever you tune in, I have some music in the background for a little bit. It's actually from my Destiny Designer album. The title of this track is called Reality Engineer. And I'm gonna figure out how to put it on my Goddess Keys platform, but for right now, you can just search Heather Amunet Destiny Designer, and you'll see all the songs on there. So each album that I'm putting out still has that subliminal aspect to it, but it's just a little bit more dancey, and I'm tapping into a lot of the places that I'm traveling, both physically and then also, I guess, astrally, for lack of a better word. So that's Reality Engineer. I'm gonna like turn it off though, because I don't know, I haven't figured out the whole speaker sound situation. And I have comments and chat off today just because I'm kind of more in the mood to do like just like a deep dive into this topic of the fifth house. So I trust that whoever catches this live, either live in this moment or whenever you see it, whether it's years from now, days from now, months from now, I trust that your questions will be answered, if not through me, then through you, okay? And, if you're interested in kind of taking a deeper dive into this topic, you can always book a Beyond the Birth Chart reading with me on Ko-Fi, or you can connect with me on Patreon. So I'm going a little bit deeper into this concept, specifically around mythology and dragons in the Patreon. So all of that information is down below, all right? So I hope that wherever you're at, that you are thriving and well. And if for whatever reason you're not that way, just know like you can switch it up, right? You don't have to go by linear time. You are the creator of your reality, and your reality is your canvas. And if your reality is feeling really full with stuff that you didn't create, then this fifth house deep dive might just be for you. So what am I calling this? I put some keywords in this particular live. Let's see, we're talking about childhood. We're talking about the trickster archetype. We're talking about mythology, and then the game board, okay? So the fifth house is a tricky house, all right? It's a tricky house. It's ruled by the trickster. It's ruled by the crossroads, okay? And so we're gonna get into that. It's a fun house. It's also really scary. And the scariness of this house has to do with the book that I'm referencing today. I'm kind of feeling nerdy. I'm always kind of feeling nerdy, to be honest. But particularly lately, I'm feeling a little nerdy. Like I want to bring in books and stuff to reference things. So the book that we're going to be bringing into this conversation today is Big Book of Dragons, Monsters, and Other Mythical Creatures. Woo! So the thing about the fifth house, so number 5 is, one of the biggest deities that I can think of that comes to mind. Well, 2 come to mind off top when it comes to number 5. You would have that Hermes energy or Ganesh energy, and also Mercury kind of energy as well. Now I know that traditionally Mercury is ruled in the third house, and we dealt with the third house already. I'm putting all of these lectures into one particular playlist called Deprogramming Astrology, and I will get through all 12 houses. And there's also a lot of like subliminals as it relates to deprogramming astrology, deprogramming different planets. So definitely check out those subliminals. So like the Mercury subliminal would be good for this particular conversation. Okay. And so I know that Mercury, the planet, is ruled by the third house, but things get tricky. And the thing about astrology that we need to deprogram is this idea that there's just one size fits all for things. So, if you look at an astrology chart, it's kind of like a weird pie chart, and it has like 12 houses or 12 slices, okay? But things aren't always as they seem, and the lines get blurred. And that's what kind of goes on with the energy of Mercury, the energy of the fifth house, okay? And we're gonna get into that. So traditionally, a traditional astrologer, first of all, not a traditional astrologer. I think y'all know that. I've been saying it for each of these deep dives that I'm doing, that I'm not an astrologer, don't want to be an astrologer, have been studying or like diving into astrology, let's see, like for more than 20 years, okay? But never like felt called to actually be an astrologer. Years ago, I came to the Oh, and sorry, like as soon as I started this live, I got like a whole bunch of background interference. So if you're hearing like random cars and stuff, we're just gonna roll with it. But yeah, I had a lot of downloads come to me a few years ago, which said that like that I needed to get out of the astrology matrix and not follow my birth chart so closely and to go beyond the birth chart. Okay. And at first it felt weird to do that. Like, because when you learn about astrology, it's supposed to be this divine design by the cosmos, right? And if you decide to transcend your birth chart, well, first of all, you have a god complex or a goddess complex. And so maybe that's why I'm sharing this information on my platform, The Goddess Keys, because we have the audacity, the folks who tune into this platform or who resonate with these particular ideas, you have the audacity to say, you know what? I write my own destiny. I write my own script. There's so many programs within the simulation that tells you, hey, go this way, do this thing. This is what you should do. This is how your life should play out. And if you choose to divert from the script, then there are consequences, okay? It's kind of like a weird game board, and we're gonna get into that. So I've been sharing that a bit around this concept of start seeing reality as more of a game board. In the last deep dive that I did on the first house, we talked a little bit about, we talked a little bit about that concept, transcending, feeling like this reality is a prison, because sometimes we get that Earth is a prison planet kind of thing, but moving from prison to game board, okay? And, if you're seeing like Earth or your reality as a prison, then you're more of an NPC, okay? You're more of like that non-playing character. But once you start moving into reality as a game board, then it's like you're live, you're active, but then you also can get caught up in a lot of loopholes, in a lot of wormholes, in a lot of weird realms and dimensions that might not really be serving you. And they might be presented as being something that's going to evolve you or grow you, but a lot of times it's not that particular way, okay? So the fifth house traditionally in astrology is the house of the child, okay? So if you have a lot of fifth house placement, so folks who come to me, I've been noticing Chiron in the fifth. I get a lot of Chiron in the fifth, moon in the fifth as well, or just like a lot of planets in the fifth house. So the folks who I've been attracting over the past couple of years have a strong fifth house kind of placement, sometimes Jupiter in the fifth as well. And what that tells me is a couple things. Number one, you have the ability to tap into a deep well of creativity. We all do, but people who have a lot of fifth house placements, it's a little bit more in their face, okay? But if you have like a Chiron in the fifth house, which is the asteroid of the wounded healer, then there might be some like trauma that was written in your reality script around childhood, okay? Or around creativity, or feeling as though you're not allowed to create, you're not allowed to be creative, okay? So that is something that you might overcome. And so a lot of people who are working on alchemizing their fifth house, one of the first things that they'll do is they'll tap into their inner child, okay? And this is something that I've done a lot, and it's been very helpful and enjoyable. But you get to a certain point where you transcend healing in the simulation. If you're always focusing on healing, like I need to heal my bloodline, I need to heal the trauma of my childhood, I need to reclaim my inner child from, or go fetch my inner child from trauma timelines and all that kind of stuff. That's valuable and it's helpful. So I'm not saying that that's not a journey to go down and all that sort of thing. But then there becomes this looping architecture that you go through, because then you get to a certain point of knowing that you're whole and complete in this now moment, and that sometimes the traumas that you experience were a form of reality engineering or programming, getting you to see your reality from a distorted lens, and then shriveling your capacity, or the simulation attempting to shrivel your capacity to create your reality. Because if you experience a lot of wounding in childhood, in your childhood script, you can loop in that wounded inner child for a really long time. So when folks start waking up, they get out of the concept of just being like in the process of grind culture, toxic productivity, work. Then you start like getting a little bit more into the inner child, and you might be like, well, why do I have these particular codependent patterns as it relates to work or relationships or body image, right? So you get into this thing of like, I need to heal my inner child. I need to go and do shadow work, which is great. You know, that's a process that we go through. But then it can also become a loop if we're not aware. Okay, so this is just something to consider. And I'm going to give you an example of social engineering and reality engineering, specifically as it relates to the inner child. Okay, so what are we taught to fear as children a lot of times? What's the one thing that we usually fear as a child, especially at dark, and when you go to sleep at night? A lot of times it's the monsters, right? Monsters under the bed, monsters in the closet. Okay, it's a part of the social engineering program to be afraid of monsters, to be afraid of mythical creatures. Now, it's interesting because children within the simulation get lots of what? Fairy tales, okay? They get lots of myths. They get lots of old wives' tales. I'm thinking about that book. I never like really got into that book, but it's called Grimm's Fairy Tales. And you'll notice like, this is actually giving me a note to go into that book a little bit more. I believe that the Three Little Pigs is in there. I'm not sure, or a Little Red Riding Hood. But you have these stories of these kind of like darker stories that are supposed to be more myths for children. And sometimes they can be a little bit more on the scarier side, okay? And a lot of times they're teaching children lessons or morality lessons, that sort of thing. But we get engineered pretty early on to be afraid of these like really big, bad mythical creatures, okay? Like the ones on here. Sometimes like this one here, the unicorn, that's a little bit more of a cuter sort of image. But like dragons and different monsters and all that kind of stuff, we're trained really early on to be afraid of. But here's the thing. This is where we get into a concept called technomancy. So I don't really believe in taking things so literally. Everything is a code within the simulation, okay? So when we talk about dragons, we may not be talking about literal live dragons. That's not to say that literal live dragons didn't exist. They very well could have, right? But dragons hold very specific symbolisms in the simulation or in the game board, okay? And so dragons represent gatekeepers. Dragons, usually you have a dragon at the end of a big test, at the end of a big battle. And if you can get through this battle with a dragon, or if you can slay a dragon, then maybe you'll get the treasure, or maybe you'll win the game, okay? So there are different codes as it relates to, for example, the dragon within the simulation. So if you're seeing, like if dragons are coming to you, if you're seeing dragons like in the astral, or when you do meditation and all of that sort of stuff, really consider what is this saying, and then usually you might want to overcome a particular fear. So dragons represent gatekeepers within the simulation, and so they are basically they're basically saying, hey, you need to pass a test before you can get a treasure, right? You need to pass a test before you can get to the other side, all right? So there's this like weird gamified feel. But gatekeeping is an illusion. You are the key, right? But you a lot of times are going to be gatekeeping yourself within the simulation. You know, there's always this fear that we have of the unknown. And, you know, sometimes things being predictable is a comfort, but the predictability within the simulation keeps us on the loop. Okay, it keeps us looping. And so one thing that we want to do as we navigate the fifth house, because it's the house of the child, but it's also the house of the underworld. I know that normally they would say that the eighth house is the house of the underworld, and I'm not saying it's not, but there is a very distinct underworld element as it relates to the fifth house. And you can look no further than the clip-off to see this, okay? So if you look at the tree of life and the tree of death architecture, to get into the clip-off, you go through number 5. You go through the fifth clipothic shell, okay? So how interesting that the house of the child, the house of play, of fun, of creativity, is also the gateway to the tree of death. This is where we get into this weird gatekeeper trickster energy. Things are not as they seem, okay? Let's take this a little further. I'm actually gonna pause for a second. And wait, do I wanna get into that yet? You know what? I don't wanna get into that fully. Okay, I'm gonna keep going with the gatekeeper sort of thing. So let's think of some gatekeeper archetypes that represent the fifth house. A really easy one is Hermes, okay? And a lot of times these mythologies, you're gonna find them in logos, you're gonna find them in name brands. So you got the Hermes luxury brand that has Hermes as their logo, okay? They incorporated that into their logo. Another fifth house deity would be Ganesh. Ganesh is usually at the crossroads and is more of a child, is a child kind of deity as well, very childlike. So a lot of your trickster deities, they have childlike aspects to them because they have that sense of play, they have that sense of creativity and kind of mischievousness, kind of like that. I don't know if y'all remember that show or that movie Dennis the Menace. They kind of have that energy. Now another one that comes to mind is Olegba. Okay, and so Olegba is in the West African pantheon, and a lot of times he appears as a child, and he has lots of candy around him. Okay, and so this kind of gets into that like Halloween sort of vibe. It's, you know, if you think about Halloween, it's a very Olegba kind of experience because you have kids out in the dark, dressed up in different costumes, a lot of trickster energy, and they're trick or treating, trickster, okay? And it's centered around children. Halloween is very much usually centered around children. Yeah, adults go to Halloween parties and all that kind of stuff, but the foundation of Halloween is that trick or treating that children do at night in the dark, in costume, and getting lots of candy and sugar, okay? We're getting into an underworld sort of thing. I know like traditional astrology would say that's more 8th house, Plutonic, that sort of thing, but it's very 5th house, okay? This is where the crossroads is in number 5. Also, number 5 is kind of an unstable, okay? It's an odd number. If you even think about like the difference between, say, a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old, or a kindergarten classroom and a 1st grade classroom. I used to teach early child, like be an early childhood educator. So this is coming to mind. But 5, you know, a whole classroom full of kindergartners is going to be a lot more chaotic than a whole classroom of 1st graders. Okay, 5 is that odd number frequency. 6 is more of like a stable frequency. And for folks who are parents, you might have also seen that with your children. Like, how is your child from age 5 versus age 6? Okay, that's another code within the simulation. It's not just that they're getting older, it's that a 5-year-old is operating on another frequency as opposed to a 6-year-old. Okay, so 5 is more of an underworld energy. Now let's talk a little bit more about the trickster and number 5, because what are a lot of light workers talking about a lot of times? 5D. I'm going to 5D. I'm going to go into the fifth dimension. I'm ascending. You know, we're ascending into the fifth dimension. And, you know, we've all been through this, okay? Or maybe you're still in 5D frequency. Cool. I personally think 5D frequency is you at the crossroads, you know, so you're healing a lot of times your wounded inner child, or you're connecting with your inner child, but then you're also going into more of the hell, quote unquote, hell realms or underworld realms when you're in that 5D frequency. Okay, that's kind of how I've seen it. It's not just one thing. So a lot of times, like ascension teachers will tell you that 5D is what? Love, light, compassion, creativity. Everything's great. We don't have all the drama. We don't have all the war. That's kind of what the light worker rhetoric would say about the fifth dimension. But then what about the fact that the clip off, like the tree of death architecture, which is in the simulation, you also enter it from number 5. Okay, now let's take children a little bit further. Okay, so on my thumbnail, I have a picture of Dorothy and who's the other girl? Alice. So we got Alice in Wonderland, and then we got the Wizard of Oz. Okay, and so these girls were about around the same age, I think, in their particular story. Both girls had issues as it related to childhood trauma in their real life. So the girl who Alice in Wonderland was created for, Lewis Carroll created Alice in Wonderland for some girl that I guess he was enamored with. And people kind of like are a little questionable, like, that's kind of weird, but okay, we'll let it slide, we guess. But it's kind of weird. He had like a weird obsession with this girl and made a whole fantasy mystery world about her. And then you have the Wizard of Oz, okay? And then Judy Garland played the Wizard of Oz in the show, in that particular movie. And if you learn more about Judy Garland's life, like it was pretty hellish as it related to her as being a child actor. And, you know, the 5th house rules creativity. It rules play. Okay, so it also rules literal plays or the theater too. Or it's one of the aspects of theater and play. You know, 12th house could also have a little bit of some theater elements as well, but also the 5th house. And so how many times have you heard stories about child actors having trauma or coming out about sexual trauma or having certain abuses happen to them while they were on set or in order to get a part? This is a part of the design of number 5 in the simulation. Okay, this doesn't mean that this has to be your reality, but this is a part of the blueprint. But it doesn't have to be your blueprint. It's just what you might find if you look at your astrology chart and you're looking to decode it and you're looking to transcend it or create your own blueprint. Okay, so these things are not coincidences. It's not a coincidence that child stars, child ruling number 5, ruling the 5th house, acting, play, that sort of stuff, imagination also ruling the 5th house. Okay, and then also this weird underworld element, crossroads element as well in it. And then you have this interesting kind of trauma stuff. So people who have a lot of 5th house placements might have some trauma around fully expressing themselves creatively, or they might be really good at creativity, but to a point where maybe they needed to go into their imagination as like a trauma response as well. So that's something. And then there also might be some wounding as it relates to your childhood, like things that you've experienced in childhood, or even like how you perceive childhood even to this day as an adult. Okay, so these are certain things that can emerge within the 5th house. Okay, next I kind of want to take it a different direction. Let's go into monsters. All right, let's talk about monsters in mythology and what the code of monsters represents. So a lot of mythical creatures are monstrous. So when we start waking up in the simulation and we start learning a little bit more about different deities and stuff like that, especially if you are like feminine identified, that sort of thing, you're kind of pushed into the goddess section, but not just any goddesses, okay? Because there's a lot of monstrous goddesses out there. But you're pushed into the pretty cute goddess sector. You got your Oshun, your Lakshmi. What else you got? You got your Brigitte. You got your, what's another like pretty cutesy goddess, like Hera? You got Demeter, that sort of stuff. Maybe an Artemis even. That's, even though Artemis is kind of getting a little less into that feminine archetype that's very pristine and pretty, because she's also in the woods, and you know, she decides to not take a counterpart. There's still a part of that very acceptable, approved goddess archetypes. But then there are these other more monstrous goddess archetypes that you can get into as well. And a lot of times you are kind of cut off from exploring that from a very young age. And a lot of times it starts in childhood because you're taught to be afraid of monsters, to be afraid of the dark. Okay, now there are codes to this. And so now I'm going to share one particular monstrous goddess archetype. Okay, and I'm referencing the book of dragons, monsters, and other mythical creatures. And we have the octopus, specifically though, the kraken. Look at that. Kraken just taking down that big old naval ship coming out of a whirlpool. Okay, scary. Very, very scary, okay? You're not really trying to identify with that particular energy, okay? You're trying to get away from it. You definitely don't want to be in the sea when the kraken is there, okay? So, but there's some interesting symbols and codes as it relates to the kraken in the simulation. Okay, so I'm going to just do a little bit of reading on this, okay? One of the most grotesque creatures in the sea is the octopus, or 8-foot, whose name was derived from the Greek octo, 8, and pus, foot. It was considered by the ancient mariners to be one of the most frightening terrors of the sea. In reality, it is a small to large, harmless mollusk, a member of the cuttlefish family, with a soft sac-like body. Okay, so now we're talking about the octopus here, but now we're going to get into the kraken, because that's that monster energy, okay? As in the saga of the kraken, a fabulous composite monster of Norwegian lore, imagined as a gigantic octopus crab rising out of the North Sea. Okay, I don't know if y'all have heard about the North Sea, or if y'all seen those videos about the North Sea. They're really fascinating to watch. I love watching the North Sea videos. And it's a crazy ocean. It's not an ocean, it's a sea. It's a crazy sea out there. You know, you see the boats like get torn up, and like apparently to work on the North Sea, you get paid a whole bunch of money because it's like one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. But it's really interesting to see the chaotic nature of the North Sea. And the reason why the waves go so high is because it's actually a very shallow sea. It's not really that deep. And so something about the way the ley lines hit makes these like extremely deathly tidal waves, okay? So this is where the kraken is supposed to reside, is in the North Sea. Now, another thing that's really interesting about the North Sea is that lots of maritime stuff goes down. So you would think in this really dangerous sea that you wouldn't have so much commercial activity. But on the contrary, it's one of the most on and popping commercial places as it relates to maritime trade and commerce, okay? And why is this applicable to us? Because we're all under maritime law. If you have a birth certificate, if you gave birth, if you were birthed by your mother, you are under maritime law, okay? So the North Sea has a lot of codes as it relates to maritime law, and the kraken has a lot of codes as it relates to maritime law, okay? So and our economic system in general. So we'll get into that a little bit more, but let's read a little bit more about the kraken. It had an enormous flat shape said to be 1.5 miles in circumference, and when it submerged, its many arms created a whirlpool that sucked down even the largest ships. Okay, so we always want to decode, all right? We could see this as a literal octopus, or that could be in the North Sea. That could be a thing. Okay, I'm not saying it's not, but I like to take a little bit more of a technomantic approach, because from what I've seen and what I've embodied, and I don't even want to say studied, but just been navigating for the past few years, I see the simulation, well, I see this reality as a simulation, and there's actually a game aspect to it. Okay, so one thing that I've learned is to look at everything as a code. Don't take it so much as at face value. Like you could read the mythology, but then there's a code that's attached to the mythology as well. Okay, and we'll get into that a little bit more. So it says, so now the whirlpool. Now, whirlpool would create a portal. Okay, if a whirlpool happens wide enough, it would open, and you can see the way these whirlpools look like in the North Sea. They're really fascinating. If you go down that whirlpool, don't know if you're coming back. Most of the time you're not, okay? But the question becomes, where does that whirlpool take you? Okay, where does it go? Now, there's this energy of the kraken being this frightful monster that is in the waters of a sea that is extremely violent, but holds a lot of commercial and economic activity within it. Okay, so something's going on here. There's a conversation happening with the waters, with the violent way that the current of the waters flows, and even with this kraken and then the sailors as well. Okay, now it says, to the same group of sea yarns or belong to the Spanish Portuguese fable of the phantom island Satan Nacio, Satan's head. I need to look that up. I don't know if y'all have heard of that. Satan's head. And so now the Spanish Portuguese fable, why is this important? Spanish Portuguese, that's kind of like the energy of the Moors, okay? And so Moors are really big with, first of all, they're the custodians of a lot of information as it relates to history and to secrets and to alchemy. Now, another word for custodian, let's think about custodian. Here we go. Let's decode custodian. Custodian, let's just go to a job title. If you're a custodian, you are taking care of a particular facility, a particular physical facility. If you are a custodian, what do you have? A lot of keys, right? You have a lot of keys. You're the holder of keys. This is gatekeeper symbolism. So when you hear the term custodian or custody, that sort of stuff, it's more than just what meets the eye. It's now we're getting into gatekeeper sort of energy. And the history of Spanish, Portuguese, Moors, which you can see all over the world, the Moors are known to hold a lot of secrets. They hold a lot of keys. They're the custodians of a lot of information. Okay, so how interesting that the Spanish Portuguese, there's a Spanish Portuguese fable about a phantom island called Satan's Hand, okay, which rose every day from the waters of the Sea of Darkness, known as the Atlantic, like a gigantic black hand to scoop up passing ships and draw them down to the depths of the ocean. Now, that's one aspect. So if you look at it more from like maritime law, or the folks who are on the seas who are doing commerce, okay, you're going to see the kraken as being, they're going to tell you that the kraken is a monster, a dangerous monster that could basically take you down and kill you at any moment, okay? But in other places, like in South, Central, and North America, the indigenous folks there, the octopus and the relatives were actually benevolent monsters. They were considered to be symbols of fertility. And now we get into the eight arms of the octopus. Now, the code for 8 is usually in, and we'll go into this more in another deep dive, what the 8th house represents. But one thing that astrology typically says that the 8th house represents is it usually represents other people's resources, okay? It's kind of more of an underworld energy of like the phantom economy, other people's resources, but like more on the hush hush, not what's in your bank account, but what creates your bank account, like that kind of economy. So how interesting that In certain indigenous cultures, the octopus is known as being more of like a fertility sort of goddess or creature. And at the same time, there is this energy of the kraken taking down different ships that are not just any ships. A lot of times these ships are doing commerce, okay? They're doing trades, deals, that kind of stuff for economic purposes, all right? So, you know, legend and lore would tell you to stay away from this kind of creature, all right? First of all, this is a very feminine creature too. You know, when you get into 8, you also get into the frequency of the womb as well. So, you know, it's also the 8th house represents sex, okay? And when you think about the womb, what does the womb do? It usually brings life into this world from another place, okay? So there's that underworld or an otherworldly kind of energy with the womb as well that's going through different, I don't even want to say dimensions, but different states of being, okay? So how could you work with, or why would you even want to work with something like this? Well, first of all, this kraken energy is definitely being weaponized against a lot of folks in the simulation, okay? So one thing that you want to do is you want to start looking at all the stuff that you were afraid of. All the stuff you were trained to be afraid of, trained to not really want to look at. It's not pretty, so I'm not going to even bother looking at it. And you want to actually start examining it a little bit more, okay? Because one thing that happens in the economic system right now, like if we think about trading, stocks, bonds, that sort of thing, the traditional economic system, one thing that we notice is that, well, there's a term, it's called unleash the kraken, okay? So I think we've been in like, haven't we been like facing a almost recession since like I think 2008 now? I think that's when, like in 2008, that's when things really started getting a little dodgy, supposedly, okay? But we know that there's been different time periods within our history, I guess, that recessions have happened, economic collapses have happened, chaos has happened. You know, if you even think about the stock market crash or Wall Street, and that's something that everybody's usually always on eggshells about. Is like, oh, is there going to be a collapse? Is there going to be a deeper recession? Is this going to be the end? That sort of thing. But when you unleash the kraken, it's actually a lot of these big companies, they want to release chaos, but they release chaos on their terms. So sometimes it's actually beneficial for them to tank certain markets or to cause chaos or collapse in certain markets, because now we're getting into this weird like destroy, rebuild kind of energy. And a lot of times this is like an energy harvesting sort of tactic. And what do? They unleash the kraken, okay? So sometimes this is happening in this could be being navigated in your particular world as well. So you want to start looking at monsters differently and seeing what they symbolize. Now the kraken, this really big creature, has a lot to do with economy, okay? And it has a lot to do with the economy of our existence as well. So that's like one example of mythology and looking at monsters and how monsters shape are things that we do every single day, things that we care about, okay? We care about the economy. We care about what the economy is doing. And there's a monstrous symbolic creature that is the forefront of that, okay? So the next thing I want to show around mythology and how this kind of connects to the 5th house element and trickster, gatekeeper element is, you know, you have these pictures of crests and seals, okay? So this is like a big thing. And this is like a form of art too, right? You know, symbolism, art. We're still in the 5th house with that, you know, creativity. Somebody had to come up with these pictures. So this in particular, these are different like seals and crests of the griffin, okay? And a lot of these were in Germany, so in the 12th century of Germany, and so a lot of royalty in Germany liked to utilize the griffin. But the griffin has an extremely long history. Okay, so it says one of the oldest legendary aerial monsters is the griffin or grips, whose name derives in every language from Greek grippos, hooked, because of its large beak. It is called griffin in English, griffon in French, griffo in Italian, and grafe in Germany. It was believed to be a ferocious monster of enormous height who fed live humans to its young. Half lion, half eagle, it was so large that one could make drinking vessels from its claws. It dwelt in the country between the Hyperboreans, the North Wind people of Mongolia, and the Armespians, the one-eyed tribe of Scythia. It was known to the Sumerians in 3000 BC under the name of Chumbaba. And we find it also in the mythological artifacts of the Sumerians, Assyrians, Babylonians, Chaldeans, Egyptians, Iranians, Syrians, Scythians, and Greeks. So all of these particular groups of civilizations I just mentioned, I mean, these civilizations contributed a lot to the simulation in different ways and to the meaning that we give to the simulation. And, you know, on the realm of children, okay, Griffin, sounds like Gryffindor, right, from Harry Potter. And, you know, Gryffindor is supposed to be the good guy, right? Like, that's the, you know, you're the brave lion. You always want to be the brave lion, right? The lion has a lot of courage and that sort of stuff. But, you know, I've seen the lion as a very trickster sort of energy within the simulation. It's presented as one way, but there's a back end to what the lion represents as well. And a lot of royalty created crests and seals to represent their families, to represent their status. And depending upon the crest and the seal that you have, and you have one, one thing you can do, maybe not everyone has one, but if you have a name that is more of like the Western hemisphere, okay, you most likely have a family crest. You have a seal. You have one of these. Look up your last name. Look up your last name and really study your crest or your seal, because somewhere in the simulation that is running in your information field. Okay, so that's something to learn and know about. Now, the griffin is supposed to be, what do they say, half lion, half eagle. So just imagine if, you know, at some point, somebody, most likely an adult, created this, gave meaning to this, and this created a certain status for them within the simulation. But can you imagine if, you know, let's say you're at work with somebody and you see somebody just randomly drawing like a half frog, half leopard, right, at work, and then they're like, oh, this represents me, and then they put it on their cubicle or something, or in their office, or I don't know, there's their background in their Zoom or whatever. You would look at them a little weird, right? Like, you'd be like, okay, like, that's kind of weird, but whatever, you do you. Or maybe like the administrator would be like, can you take that off of your background? It's kind of weird. But, you know, and so a lot of times this imagination, this mythology, we're discouraged from engaging in it. And yet it has meaning. It actually has status within the simulation. And so at some point, one person decided that they were going to merge a lion and an eagle together and make meaning out of it. Okay. And so one thing that you could do is like look into your particular family crest. What meaning does that image have for you? And is that something you want? Okay. Because a lot of times the crest is showing different social, like your social status, for example. Yeah, it's showing where you rank within the simulation. And this is where we want to get into this concept of actually creating our own mythology. Okay, it's one thing to study mythology. Like I can like study all these different animals, lots of different cool pictures and images in here. But we never want to just stay with what's been created already. We actually want to constantly be generating new mythology, new meaning. So right now we're stuck in a lot of cycles. Like if you notice, I've studied lots of different mythology and lots of different gods, goddesses, deities for several years because it's just been a really big interest of mine. But you start noticing these loops and repetitions with it. Okay, so you might have a deity from the Hindu pantheon that matches a deity from the Yoruba pantheon. Okay, that matches a deity from the Greek pantheon. These are codes. Okay, so what's happening is no matter where you incarnate on the planet, you'll have the same code of a particular deity that you can look to, or maybe a logo that you can look to that will give you that same code, no matter if you, let's say, incarnate in India or incarnate in Nigeria or incarnate in Brazil. There's going to be something, even though the deity might have a very different name, maybe the backstory is a little different, but a lot of the symbols and a lot of the codes will remain the same, okay? That's what keeps things predictable. And how does this relate to astrology? Because especially when you start going into the asteroids, well, first let's start with the planets. Notice how the planets are all named out of deities from mythology. Okay, so at some point there's some kind of instruction set that's going on within the simulation related to, quote, mythological beings that might be holding weight within your reality. So that's something that you would want to explore, but from more of a technomancy sort of vibe, where you're not just studying the actual deity, but you start looking at the codes that that deity represents, okay? And that's going to show up. These deities are living in different houses in your birth chart. So it might be good to know about it. Then when you add the asteroids into it, then it just opens up a whole smorgasbord of deities, okay? And it's telling a particular story. But it doesn't mean that you work with those specific deities, but it might mean that certain codes that these deities are related to have a very large, overwhelming influence in your life, or a lot of times in your loop within the simulation. So there is a lack of creativity, or there's a gatekeeping of creativity within the simulation. And that's done by design. That's done on purpose to keep things predictable and to keep things from not getting too chaotic, right? Because if you started giving, quote, license for people to start creating their own mythologies and you started validating those mythologies, it's a lot more difficult for you to track what's going on with those people, okay? So what do? You gatekeep creativity, you gatekeep the arts, right? They're very important. I've said this in the last live that arts creates the simulation, but at the same time, only certain people are allowed to create the mythology, okay? So these royal families, they were able to put this griffin on their crest, right? But at some point, when did we stop making our own crests, you know? We just kind of inherited certain crests, like we're wearing certain crests that maybe we don't even know that we're wearing. Like there's a certain animal, there's a certain monster that could be on the family crest that we're attached to. How much do we know about it? And how is that coding us within the simulation? Another thing you want to look at when it relates to family crest, don't just focus on the crest that you were born with your name as you were birthed into the simulation. If you ever were married, you want to look at that family crest as well, because the family crest that you were birthed in with is having a very specific story or conversation with the family crest that you may be married into. Okay, so if one family crest is seen as being more dominant than another one, okay, then that is where we get into that weird stuff around destiny swapping, karmic transference, that sort of stuff, because it's almost like a brand or an ownership signature that you're coded with within the simulation that says, I'm not as valuable as this family crest, so therefore my resources can be taken, my essence can be taken, okay? So these are some of the ways that codes work within the simulation. And to start wrapping your head around this, you can start researching the family crest that you were born into or married into, and do as much background information or research that you can on it to see how it was created, the symbolism of everything that's on that crest, what it means, start decoding it, okay? So one thing that I have a big background in, just how I was raised and my family lineage and all that, is herbalism. So when I was like really kind of in my awakening journey in the beginning, I worked with plants, physical plants. I still do. But I work with plants very differently now. So I worked with physical plants by like making different teas and concoctions, baths, all that kind of stuff. I still do that from time to time. But now a technomantic point of view that I've gotten into a lot more is, what code does an herb have? Okay, what code is happening? And because I travel a lot, I look a lot around, like what kind of plants are around me. And a lot of times it's giving off codes of, well, what am I exploring? What's going on in my particular game board, okay? And I can go way, way deeper with that. I'm not going to right now, but there are a lot of times different codes as it relates to different plants that you're around. They might represent a numerical frequency. They also usually can represent a mythological lore. I'm gonna give you an example. There is the mint plant. So there's a mint plant. I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this deity's name correctly. Okay. So there was a nymph. So not quite a deity, but kind of, nymphs are like more deities, known as being a little bit more supernatural. They usually are around the waters, like the fresh waters. So there was a nymph by the name of Minty, or it's like Mintee, I think. Okay, so I might be wrong about the exact spelling or pronunciation. Okay, but basically, as the lore goes, she was an underworld nymph. Okay, and Hades was like really trying to get into her. And so, let's think about nymphs. What do they represent? Nymphomaniacs. Okay, usually like really sexy, that kind of stuff, right? And usually there's tons of stories about nymphs being chased by different gods, all right? Like being desired by different gods. And there's this constant story of nymphs just being so irresistible to different gods, male gods, that they have to run away from them and then transform into something else to get some peace. Okay, another example would be the nymph by the name of Daphne, okay? And you can even find this in television. I don't know if y'all have ever seen that show called Frasier. But if you look at that show, Frasier, you'll see that one of the characters in there, her name is Daphne Moon. She's the caregiver in the show. She's caregiving Frasier's dad, Frasier Crane's dad in the show. And Frasier's brother just finds her completely irresistible, like immediately as soon as he sees her. And that's the ongoing joke for a long time in the show, is like he's pining after her. He wants her so bad. He fantasizes about her. He ends up marrying her towards the end. But there's this constant thing of him just pining after her, wanting her, calling her a goddess. And how interesting, or maybe it's just a coincidence, right? Like that this character was named Daphne Moon. Daphne named after a nymph, Moon, very lunar, goddess kind of feminine energy. And we're seeing that play out. Okay, so that's a side note. That's Daphne the nymph. Let's go back into Minty, the nymph, or the nereid is another word for this particular freshwater nymph. So anyway, Hades was really trying to get with her, okay? And she didn't run away from Hades. Actually, Persephone, I don't know if y'all know, because, a lot of times we hear about Persephone being that underworld goddess. She's in the upper world for 6 months out of the year, and then she's in the underworld for another 6 months out of the year. And I didn't know this about Persephone, but she was mad that Hades was trying to get with this particular nymph Mint, mint is the root word. Mint. We're talking about the plant mint. So I don't know how you pronounce the rest of her name, but just focus on the mint part. So basically, Persephone gets jealous and turns her into a mint plant. Well, some people say that Persephone gets jealous and turns her into a mint plant. And then another version is that Hades saves her by turning her into a mint plant. Okay, so that's why mint is kind of like, it's first of all, it represents abundance. So when we think about our economic system, right? What prints the money, it's particularly in the United States, it's a place called the mint. Okay, but it's an underworld energy, and there's a lot of underworld elements as it relates to economics. Now, another layer to this is you have this lore of nymphs being chased by gods, lusted after by gods, and I believe Daphne, the nymph Daphne, she ended up transforming herself into some kind of a tree just to get away from, I think it was Apollo, just to get away from Apollo. All right, she just wanted peace. She had to get out, okay, and she had to transform herself into a tree. But here's another element, royalty. So we looked at some of these royal crests, okay? Royalty, there was a tradition of royalty wanting to be descendant from nymphs. If they could prove that they were descendant from nymphs, then that would validate their rule over the land and over the waters, because nymphs were very connected to the waters and they had a divine capacity or a command over the waters. And so there was this energy of, I need to marry a nymph because now my rule or my reign is ordained. So look that up. Don't take my word for it, okay? So that's kind of interesting. And then now we have this thing around like patriarchs, whether they are, and they're usually of high status. So we have patriarchs of high status, either gods or royalty, chasing and lusting after nymphs because of codes that they have as it relates to natural resources, okay? So we have that happening. And then we have this really interesting story of a nymph being transformed into a mint leaf, which represents prosperity, big time, almost like so much so that the literal place where money is printed is called the mint. Maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe I'm just like looking too much into it. But there also are codes as it relates to this, because a lot of times the simulation is run by different scripts and loops. And there's stories we've already heard of before. So what does this have to do with you and your astrology chart? Especially when you start getting into your asteroids and you start looking at all the different deities, and there's also nymphs and nereids and stuff like that you can look up and all that sort of stuff. You can start seeing the script that's running in your simulation, okay? So you might have like a nymph script running in your simulation. You might have like a interesting kind of like kraken script, Tiamat script. Like you could have these sorts of scripts running within your reality. And, you know, I used to call this soul contracts. Okay, I used to call this soul contracts, where it's like or soul agreements, where you make agreements to participate in certain things. But I'm noticing, and my perception is expanding and seeing it's actually not really soul contracts or contracts as much as they are loops that you're in. And if you don't see the patterns or the codes of those loops, you just kind of stay in there. And this is going to determine the sort of partners that you attract or the certain experiences that you have within, your childhood, and then moving on down. And you won't get to this information until you start getting into that trickster, gatekeeper kind of energy. Okay. So we could just see these as being, they're just stories. They're just stories, but maybe there's more. Maybe there are codes too. And sometimes there's not a lot of originality within the simulation. They want to keep things really predictable. So, if you think about it, like put yourself in the position of a programmer in the simulation. One thing about, engineering and stuff like that and programming is they want predictability. And if there is chaos, they want it on their terms, okay? So if you have all of these storylines that are super original, then it's harder for it to be predictable. If you think about this, when we think about like Hollywood and stuff, like sometimes people complain and they're like, oh, why does it seem like it's the same movie over and over again? Like, why isn't there more like originality? It's that same kind of concept, okay? So your life script or your life track a lot of times could have a lot of codes and mirror a lot of things in mythology. So you would want to, the first step would be learning as much as you can about mythology and learning about the different stories and looking beneath the surface with them. But then you would want to get into the energy of creating your own mythology, okay? And this is some big fifth house energy, okay? This is some big destiny designer energy. And you also have to have the audacity to create your own mythology and to put things together that maybe have never existed, and for that to be your mythology. That's how you break loops too, okay? Otherwise, you get recycled into these same scripts that have already been pre-approved, okay? And then that's why you feel like there's a monotony and you feel like it's hard for you to break out of a particular pattern. It's because it's running a very prescribed coded loop within the simulation. All right. Now, once you start getting into that reality engineer or destiny designer kind of energy, art is really big. Creativity is really big. Your inner child is really big, but not from the place of, oh, my poor inner child, I need to heal it or listen to it and stuff. It's like, no, like bring that childlike play, that childlike joy into your reality, okay? And partner with that childlike aspect of yourself. But, a lot of people will tell you to focus on the inner child, but it's also about focusing on your inner teen. Now, your inner teen is a lot more trickier. If you look at I did a live on the inner teen where I go more in depth with it. I think I called it Lilith is dark, something about Lilith and dark matter energy. And I talk about how a lot of times like the teen, like you connecting with your inner teen will help you to, it's kind of like a interesting, I'm not going to say the inner teen is like a gatekeeper, but if you were to think about your higher self and your quote demon or daemon, your inner teen would be your daemon, okay? Another way to look at this is in astrology would be North Node, South Node. North Node would be your higher self. South Node would be your quote lower self or daemon, okay? So the daemon, and when you connect with your daemon, that's usually, that's connecting more with that energy of 5 and that energy of play and creativity. And, if you think about the inner teen, a lot of times we don't really want to work with our inner teen too much because so much social engineering was done to shut down our inner teen. Teens get a really bad rap in the simulation because they're in a weird kind of trickster energy. They're not quite an adult yet, but they're not really a child either. Okay, they're in this weird liminal space. And then they're also, their hormones are coming on board. They have these like sexual urges. They're being treated like a child and they want more respect, but they still kind of have to abide by certain rules. There's a lot of constriction with the inner teen. And a lot of times the teen has to like push down a lot of their emotions, okay, and silence their voice. And also a lot happens with the inner teen as it relates to image, how you're perceived, shame, that sort of thing. If you think about how much pressure is put on teens to look a certain way, to weigh a certain way. They're getting this new body that they're not quite, they don't really know what's going on, and it just feels really awkward. So if you went through like an awkward teenage stage, and most people have, it's kind of like, the way things go, you might not really want to listen to your inner teen. There's been a lot to shut that aspect of you down. But the inner teen is like a gateway. There's a gateway energy with that inner teen because they're not quite a child, they're not quite an adult, They're starting to come into their sexuality. So there's this liminal space. So if you can access that inner teen, then you can actually start really working on untapping some ignored or stored away creative potential. But to get to that, you kind of need to go through that underworld aspect of, you have to like retrieve your inner teen from the underworld. Okay. So, and look no further than Dorothy and Alice. They're not quite children, but they're not quite teens. Maybe they're like in a pre-teen kind of phase. I'm not sure exactly how old they were, but yeah, if you look at them, if you look at the way they're perceived, like maybe they're around, I don't know, 11, 12, that sort of thing. They're not quite like, they're not like that carefree 5, 6, 7-year-old sort of thing. Okay, and then you have these really interesting elements that they're going through where, there's trauma that's really, that is under the storylines of Alice in Wonderland as well as Wizard of Oz. Even if you look at the storyline, what happens in Wizard of Oz, Dorothy runs away because she didn't feel understood by her aunt. Notice her parents weren't there, so she was being raised by her aunt, and she didn't really like the energy there. Everything was black and white too. So she ends up going away because she was misunderstood, and then she gets caught up in this tornado or this other world kind of energy. Okay. Meanwhile, if you really read Alice in Wonderland, if a psychologist or a psychiatrist were to be evaluating Alice and some of the dialogue that she's having, even before she gets into these weird realms, Alice doesn't look at the world the way a typical child does. Okay. And a psychologist might diagnose her even before she goes into Wonderland. If you look at the dialogue that she's having with herself, that's not to say she is crazy, but the simulation might typecast her as being that. So both of these characters show a liminal space that they're navigating. So number 5 is interesting. The 5th house isn't all of what it seems. The last thing, I'm going to wrap this up and I'm going to bring in the clown. Let's send in the clowns. I've got to send in the clowns, y'all. Okay. Because we're talking about the trickster. So I can't not bring up the clowns. Okay. Because, the clown archetype also represents that liminal space. Even if you look into the sacred clown, which is another frequency of 5 as well, the sacred clown or the heyoka is usually painted black and white. So they're neither this or that, they're both. Okay, so they represent the liminal space, and they also represent trickster energy. The thing about the sacred clown in indigenous cultures is they would be, their humor would be the healing. Okay, and what they would do, the villages would depend on them to scare away the monsters. Okay, there would be a big monster, mythical creature that would come to terrorize their village, right? The sacred clown or the heyoka was in charge of neutralizing the threat. But they wouldn't do it through fighting. They wouldn't do it through war. They would do it through humor, but not just any kind of humor. They would dress up like that mythical creature. They would dress up like the monster. Actually, I mean, maybe it wasn't mythical. They would dress up like the monster and they would become that monster in order to neutralize the threat. Okay, because the idea was if they could become the thing, then the threat would dissolve. Okay, because if you become the scary, then it's not scary because it's a part of you. Okay, so the sacred clown had to really master duality and polarity integration in order to do this. Well, what does this have to do with children? What does this have to do with the 5th house? Clowns, children. It's kind of interesting how clowns are utilized to entertain children, because I don't know about y'all, I never really cared about clowns, or I'm not going to say I was afraid of clowns when I was a child, but I never wanted to see a clown. I never like requested to go see clowns. Maybe some people did, but clowns are very much connected with children. Okay. And we're going to leave it on this. This is going to be an ellipses. So a lot of high order secret societies, if you get to the high Masonic orders, one thing you're going to notice about them is they have a clown order, okay, where they just dress up as clowns. The highest Masonic order will dress up as clowns. And what will they do? They work a lot with children's hospitals. Interesting. It's interesting. So we have this energy of gatekeeping, okay? Because in order for you to be in a particular secret society or Masonic order, you have to pass through certain gates. We have an energy of the trickster, okay? And then we also have the energy of the child, all right? All in one go with that. So 5 is messy. 5 is messy. You get your hands messy through art. You get your hands messy through or you get out of linear thinking through mythology and looking past it as just being a story and looking at it more as being a code. And then if you're like really getting into this whole idea of creating your own reality, you start creating your own mythology. And then you also have this energy of navigating life like a game, not taking things too seriously. If we think about just how important comedians are very important. And, you know, I was looking at this one comedian that I really like right now. And it was so interesting because he has this way of taking some really weird, traumatic stuff and making it super funny. And he has that like sacred clown kind of energy. And he's doing he's almost like providing a therapy for people who watch him. Because when I was like looking at his comments, they weren't saying, ha, 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 that's so funny. Like a lot of times people would just start talking about like, hey, this happened to me. And, you know, so it's like a way, the humor is used as a way, as a gateway to just kind of open up like maybe repressed emotions and that sort of thing. Okay. And this is why a lot of times comedians, they hold a lot. They hold a lot of energy. You have to have that, neither this nor that. You have to have that trickster, liminal space energy to master comedy. And yeah, that's number 5. It's messy. It's more than just the child. It's really starting to open the gates for you to see the code of the simulation. That's what the 5th house does, okay? And then you heal your relationship with creativity and you reclaim your creativity. You invite creativity, joy, humor into your life as a way of not just surviving, but creating and thriving, creating the world that you want to see. But to do that, I mean, it requires so much alchemy. You have to alchemize so much to keep that lightheartedness and not take things too seriously. And what are the secret societies, the top orders of them doing? They're clowning around, y'all. All right, they're clowning around and they're hanging out at children's hospitals, okay? So yeah, I know it's ending weird because it's a weird vibe, okay? I'm not team 5D love and light, okay? I think I see 5D, I don't really believe in dimensions, to be honest. They're just constructs of the simulation, but the energy of 5 brings you into a weird wormhole, okay? And things that are supposed to be pure and wholesome always have a backstory to them, okay? And that's why you start looking at all of the stuff you were raised with as a child, like, oh, another one, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Willy Wonka was freaking insane. I mean, yeah, like, if you look at that movie now, that used to be one of my favorite movies when I was a kid, but when I looked at it like a few years ago, I'm like, this is not okay. Like, like I would not be okay to have my kid here, you know? But this is when you start decoding it, it's not just all sunshine and roses. There's a liminal space, and it usually happens in childhood where there's supposed to be something really bright and supposed to make you laugh, but there's also an underbelly that's supposed to make you cry. And it's designed this way in the game board. And you want to think about the checkerboard, right? The checkerboard has black and white. And, you know, checkerboards are a lot, you see checkerboards a lot in games, but you also see them in secret societies. And, you know, even the tree of life and the tree of death is a checkerboard as well. And you can't just navigate the checkerboard and only go on the, like, you have to kind of maneuver. You have to maneuver the black and the white, okay? And so that's the energy of 5. It's tricky, it's gnarly, it's fun, but you know, you first kind of go into that really shadow underbelly realm to start kind of getting your rhythm with it, okay? So if you want to learn more about how to decode your specific birth chart, not from a way to keep you in your life script, but to transcend it, you can check out my Beyond the Birth Chart reading. And I also am doing some stuff related to the dragons right now and the gatekeeping element of the dragons on Patreon. And then I have like that subliminal, that dragon subliminal. There's like a, if you go on my YouTube, the latest video is like a red dragon subliminal. Yeah, and so that is getting at some of the energy of this topic. So if this topic was of interest to you, you might want to check out that red dragon subliminal as well. Other links are below. If you want to learn more about technomancy and what I mean about decoding the simulation, you can check out my book, The Architect is Her. And sending y'all lots of love and joy, and I hope you stay playful, stay humorous, don't take things too seriously, and create your own mythology. Bye, everyone.